Thank you everyone for joining us today and being a part of our professional learning webinar on FAFSA 101. Next slide. Before we begin, we would like to thank our partners and sponsors who help make these webinars happen. Alabama Possible partners with the Alabama Commission on Higher Education, the Alabama Community College System, and the Alabama State Department of Education. Next slide. Just a few housekeeping rules. The first might be the most important, so please keep your microphones muted throughout the entire webinar just to avoid feedback while our speakers are presenting. Another one is this webinar will be recorded and posted on our YouTube channel, which you can see the link here. So if you missed something and you want to go back, you can always go back to it and find it on YouTube. And lastly, if at any point during the presentation that you have a question, please submit it in the chat box so we can make sure to answer it during our Q&A session. I just want to emphasize really quickly that our Q&A session will be short. So if you provide your email address with the questions, if we don't get to it, we can be sure to email you your answer. Next slide. You can find Alabama Goes to College on social media via Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And while you're posting and building that college going culture, we would love it if you use some of these hashtags below to promote the college going culture. Next slide. Now I'm going to turn it over to my colleague May, who serves as the Data and Research Manager at Alabama Possible.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. We really appreciate your time, and I just want to start this webinar first by acknowledging the incredible work that you're doing in all different kinds of circumstances. So thank you again for partnering with us at Alabama Goes to College and for giving us your time this morning. As most of you know, Alabama Goes to College equips educators with tools and relationships so that every high school senior can plan for, pursue, and complete valuable post-secondary credentials. So high schools should sign up at alabamapossible.org/register2020-21. If you're an educator, please check with your coworkers to make sure your school has registered. We do only need one representative from each school to complete the form. So just make sure to check in with your coworkers, see if your school has already registered. But if you haven't, then please go to that link and complete the form. If you're here because you have already registered and you know that your school is on our list, please make sure that you received our first newsletter that went out last Wednesday. So that was Wednesday, September 23rd. If you did not receive an email newsletter from us and you know that your school has already registered, then please type your email address and the words "I didn't receive the newsletter" in the chat box, just so that we can follow up with you and make sure that you're on our list. So again, type your email address and the words "I didn't receive the newsletter" in the chat box so we can follow up with you. All right, and we'll get on to the main part of our presentation today. So there are three components to the Alabama Goes to College campaign, but today we are going to focus on Cash for College, which builds awareness around financial aid for post-secondary education. And we know that paying for college is a common concern for students and families who are thinking about education after high school. Completing the free application for federal student aid, or the FAFSA, is a key step in pursuing and affording college. So our goal with Cash for College is for every graduating senior to complete that FAFSA before they graduate from high school so that they can access federal, state, and institutional aid to pay for college. All right, next slide, please. So today we're going to learn what the FAFSA is, why students and families should complete it, what the different types of financial aid are, what steps are included in completing the application and receiving aid, how you can promote FAFSA completion in remote and in-person learning environments, and then resources you can consult for further assistance. And I'd like to say this webinar is meant to be introductory, so we'll mostly be covering the basics. If you've been working with the FAFSA for a while, you might be familiar with this information. However, it never hurts to refresh our memories, and we'll also be discussing some updates specific to this new FAFSA cycle, along with some resources specific to addressing the challenges that have been created by COVID. So please hang on through the end to get all of that new information. Like Keela said, we're more than happy to accept your questions throughout the webinar. We'll collect them so that we can address them towards the end of today's webinar. We'll mostly be sticking to those basics and won't be getting too specific about individual scenarios, but of course we're happy to follow up with you via email if you do have a very specific scenario you want us to address. And with that, we will have an advanced FAFSA webinar, just so you know. It'll be occurring later this fall, and that will be geared more towards navigating tricky or more complex scenarios. So with all that in mind, feel free to shoot us your questions, but just know that today we're covering the basics. So the FAFSA is the free application for federal student aid. It gives students access to the largest source of financial aid for certificates or degrees. So that's whether it's at a 2-year or a 4-year program. And federal aid includes many types of financial aid, which we'll describe in detail, but one type of aid that we always like to emphasize is the Pell Grant. So if you'll go to the next slide. The Pell Grant is aid that does not need to be paid back. And this can be used again towards technical and academic programs. And the majority of students in Alabama are eligible for a full or partial Pell Grant. The current maximum award is $6,345 per year, and that typically increases every year. You can go to the next slide. Perfect. So this amount is really significant because the average cost of tuition and fees per year at a 2-year college in Alabama is $4,770. If you'll go to that next slide, please. Yeah, so if we know the current maximum Pell Grant award is $6,345, we know that already covers the average cost of tuition and fees at a 2-year college in Alabama. Next slide. So not only does completing the FAFSA determine eligibility for awards like the Pell Grant, but it also strongly correlates with positive post-secondary outcomes, including increased college enrollment, persistence, and attainment. So here you see on this slide, research shows that 9 out of 10, or 90% of students who complete the FAFSA enroll in college the following fall. So completing the FAFSA is just setting up your students for success. But only 53% of high school seniors in Alabama had completed a FAFSA by the end of June. So we're talking about the class of 2020 here. And a 53% FAFSA completion rate in our state means that millions of dollars in aid are left on the table annually. Research by FCAN, the Florida College Attainment Network, estimates that 57.4% of high school graduates in Alabama qualify for a Pell Grant. This year, 47% of high school students in Alabama failed to complete their FAFSA, and that's about 23,915 students. Of that number, of that 23,915, about 13,727 of those students would probably have qualified for a Pell Grant. And then using the most recent data from the US Department of Education, we know that the average Pell Award for a student in our state is around $4,303. And this means that close to $60 million are left on the table when students do not complete their FAFSA. So this really underscores why we encourage every student in our state to complete this application and not make assumptions about their eligibility. All right, next slide. So just to recap, the free application for federal student aid determines eligibility for financial aid based on financial need, and that's determined by a number of factors. The FAFSA can be completed at fafsa.gov or using the My Student Aid app beginning October 1st, so starting tomorrow. And high school seniors can get started with the process before October 1st, doing some pre-work steps. And then once the application opens, they can begin working on it and submitting. Important to note real quick that students will complete the FAFSA every year that they are in a post-secondary program, and that new FAFSA cycle is going to begin in October of every year. So here we see on the screen how aid is calculated, and it's calculated through the following formula. We start with the cost of attendance, which is determined by the financial aid office of the institution, and it includes the total cost of things like tuition, books, room and board, etc. And from that, we subtract the estimated family contribution, or EFC, which takes into account things like income, benefits, and family size. And this EFC determines what the family is able to contribute to the cost of college. So when we take the cost of attendance and we subtract the estimated family contribution, we determine the student's financial need and how much needs-based aid that they'll qualify for. So why complete the FAFSA? Just to reiterate, students may be eligible for up to $6,345 per year in Pell Grant aid. Many scholarships also require that students complete the FAFSA. And then it also signals to college admissions offices that students are really serious about attending their school. All right, so there are 4 types of financial aid, which I'll summarize really succinctly, but we have our grants, which are gift aid that doesn't have to be paid back, and they're often needs-based, like the federal Pell Grant. Then we have our scholarships, which are another form of gift aid. It can be awarded for anything, including academics, athletic achievement, or volunteer work. And it can come from all different kinds of organizations, like community-based organizations, the college itself. Then we have our work study, which helps students get part-time jobs to help cover the cost of college. And lastly, we have our loans, which are borrowed money that must be paid back with interest, so that extra charge that's going to grow over time. So these are examples of specific awards that students might be eligible for, whether it's a grant based on financial need or family circumstances or career aspirations and commitments, or loans that are either subsidized or unsubsidized. Filling out the FAFSA will determine eligibility for all of these kinds of aid. Now, federal student aid can be used towards expenses such as tuition and fees, books and supplies, transportation, childcare for dependents, and room and board. So here are some common comments that we certainly hear and know you might hear as well. Things like, college isn't for me, I probably don't qualify for financial aid, I'm going to get a sports scholarship, so I don't need to fill out the FAFSA. When am I going to have time to do this on top of classes and extracurricular activities? How am I going to get this financial information from my parents or guardians? And why is my child or school asking for my financial information? And so to combat those pervasive thoughts or comments, we're trying to educate students with key messaging like the FAFSA is free to complete. It's for both technical and professional certificates and academic degrees. Students may be eligible for up to $6,345 in a Pell Grant. So many scholarships require FAFSA completion. So even if you're getting that sports scholarship, you might have to do the FAFSA as a first step. Early completion beginning October 1st is really important. Lots of aid is first come, first serve. And then we really want to emphasize that they should be aware of priority deadlines at their school. So we have linked a list of priority deadlines for Alabama colleges and universities, and we'll be sending out these slides later on. But you can also find this list in our educators toolkit by visiting alabamagoestocollege.org, and that's Alabama spelled out and the number 2, alabamagoestocollege.org, if someone wants to add that to the chat for me. All right, so we're also trying to educate parents and guardians with key messaging like the FAFSA is safe and secure using FAFSA.gov. It is only used to determine your student's eligibility for financial aid. Your student needs your help in getting key information from you in order to complete this application. The sooner you complete the form, the better chance you have of receiving various types of aid. And even if you think your family does not qualify, it's really good to have the FAFSA on file in case of the unexpected. And a lot of what we're going to talk about today, later on in the webinar, are concerns around financial circumstances changing because of COVID. So when I'm giving my 2019 tax documents to this application, does that actually represent my 2020 financial circumstances? So what do we do to make sure that my college knows my financial need? So let's talk briefly about eligibility requirements. To be fully eligible to accept federal financial aid, a student must have a high school diploma or a GED. They must be enrolled or accepted as a regular student in an eligible degree or certificate program. Must be registered with the Selective Service if male. Have a valid Social Security number, although there are definitely some exceptions here. Have satisfactory academic progress, and then sign certifying statements on the FAFSA. And those certifying statements are things like you're not in default on federal student loans. That mostly pertains to current college students. You do not owe money on a federal student grant, and you will use federal student aid only for educational purposes. So if a student is not a US citizen or a US national, they must be able to provide other documentation, such as a green card, an arrival departure record, the I-94, battered immigrant status, or a T visa, or a parent with a T1 visa. And even if an immigrant student does not have one of these records, they may still complete the FAFSA as a record of family need. However, they might not be eligible to receive federal aid. They may still be able to receive state or private aid. And please note that the above mostly applies to students and not their parents. So financial aid for a student is never going to depend on the citizenship status of their parents. So we often get questions about students who are citizens of the US who might have parents who are undocumented, and the parent's citizenship status is never going to impact the student. All right, and on. So schools receiving federal aid must also meet eligibility requirements, including accredited by the US Department of Education's Office on Post-Secondary Education. The type of aid available will vary by institution, so we recommend calling the institution to confirm the types of aid that are available in a college you're interested in. So now we'll review the process for completing the application. So there's a new cycle every year, and there's often a little bit confusion around the years associated with the FAFSA. So the FAFSA application is named after the year the aid is awarded. So the 2021-22 FAFSA is used to apply for financial aid for fall semester 2021 through summer semester 2022. So most high school seniors will start applying when the application opens up tomorrow, and they'll be applying for aid for the 2021-22 school year, and that would be their first year of post-secondary education. In some instances, if a high school senior begins college this summer after their high school graduation, they might need to complete the 2020-2021 FAFSA. In all instances that involve questions about applying for aid during the summer, it is best to ask the college which FAFSA to complete, and they'll give you guidance on that. So let's highlight a few of the changes to the FAFSA for the 2021-22 cycle. So the income threshold for an automatic zero EFC has increased from $26,000 to $27,000 for this award year. And as a reminder, the EFC is what determines what the family is able to contribute towards the cost of college. So if income is $27,000 or less, then the family is expected to contribute $0 towards the cost of college, meaning they're eligible for a full Pell Grant. So I don't want to get too much into the weeds with this next update, but the application was updated so that the question asked about Schedule 1 on the tax forms will automatically be answered if the applicant uses the IRS's data retrieval tool to transfer their tax information. And we're going to talk a lot more about that data retrieval tool, but essentially what this update is saying is that it will ideally pull through the relevant tax information automatically, whereas before you had to enter that in manually. So the online FAFSA form provides faster feedback. As you see in the screenshot, applicants might receive error notifications that can then immediately be addressed as they complete the forms fields. And a wonderful update that I think should clear up a lot of confusion is that questions that refer to specific lines on tax forms, those questions will be accompanied by an image of the tax form, and that image will be highlighted to show where the information can be found. So ideally, if a student has the tax documents in front of them, they can see on their computer screen exactly where they need to look on their tax documents. Like we mentioned earlier, there are a few ways to file the FAFSA. One way is online at fafsa.gov, and the other way is through the My Student Aid mobile app. And you can actually go back and forth between completing the application through the app on your phone or on a tablet and completing the FAFSA on a computer or a desktop. So we'll give a quick overview of the main steps to applying for and receiving aid. So steps 1 and 2, these can be done in either order, and like I alluded to, they can actually be done well in advance of October 1st. So you can consider gathering the necessary documents and creating an FSA ID as pre-work before October 1st. And then step 3, you'll actually fill out the application all the way through step 7, which is receiving those financial aid award letters. So let's start off with step 1. Go to the next slide. Yeah. So step 1 is to gather the documents. It can save time and really ensure accuracy if students and families have the necessary paperwork. So this includes the student's social security number or alien registration number, the dates of birth for the student and the parents or guardians, the parents or guardians' social security number if the student is considered a dependent for FAFSA purposes, And I want to emphasize that because dependency for FAFSA purposes is not the same thing as dependency for federal income tax purposes. They'll also need prior year tax returns. So this year's FAFSA cycle will require 2019 tax returns. They'll need records of untaxed income. So these are things like child support received, interest maybe, veterans benefits, things like that. They'll need records of other benefits like Social Security, disability, SNAP, TANF, etc. And then sometimes they'll need information on cash, savings and checking accounts, real estate assets. But this last bullet doesn't pertain to everyone. Not everyone would have to provide this information. So this is a comprehensive list, and not everyone will have to have all of this. But we frequently hear from counselors that it's hard to get parents or guardians to provide this information, and that's why we really encourage starting the messaging as early as possible so families have the time to prepare and collect the necessary information. And we heard from one counselor in Alabama who sends out text reminders during tax season to hold on to these documents because you'll need them in October for the FAFSA. Thought that was a really great idea, just having that consistent messaging throughout the year that when families are doing their tax returns, January through April, they're thinking, oh, hey, I need to set this aside and have it for my student when October rolls around. All right, next slide. So step 2, which you can do step 1 or 2 in either order, is to create an FSA ID. And this is essentially a username and password. Many high schools do a great job of introducing the FSA ID to their juniors so that everything's ready to go when it comes to apply during their senior year. And the FSA ID can sometimes take 3 days to be verified through the system. So one thing I recommend is not scheduling a FAFSA workshop for the same day that students create their FSA IDs. Know that you need a little bit of wiggle time for the ID to be verified before a student can even begin the application. You can create one of these by going to FAFSA.gov, and both the student and a parent or guardian must have one unless the student is considered independent by federal guidelines. And this also serves as the electronic signature when you're submitting the application online. One tip is to encourage families to use a personal email account that's not subject to change like a school or work email might. So here's a screenshot of the student logging in with their FSA ID. And now we'll move on to step 3, which is the actual application. It's comprised of several sections, starting off with student demographics. So we'll go to the next slide. The name entered must match the Social Security card. That's one important note. And if the student has a driver's license, that's often helpful to verify their identity, but it's not required. And when the student's asked, are you interested in being considered for work study? We always recommend that the student put yes, and they can always later decline, but it never hurts to see if you have an opportunity to get work study. And then when you're actually entering your first year of post-secondary, then you make that decision if that's something you have the time to do, because it's going to be a part-time job that takes some of the hours of your week, and if it's a financial need of yours to have that extra bit of income to cover college expenses. So moving on to the school selection page, this is where students indicate where they want their financial aid eligibility information sent, and you must put at least one school. We encourage every student to put at least one local college or university. In Alabama, you do not need to list a state school first to be considered for state eligibility. And with this page, you can search by school name or location, or if you already have the school's code, then you can enter that right in. And you can add up to 10 schools on the initial submission. Then once you've submitted your FAFSA, you can log back in and add additional schools. So you're going to send it to all the different colleges and universities that you're considering enrolling in. So here's what the screen looks like when the student is selecting the colleges that they want to receive their FAFSA information. Now the application then walks the student through a series of questions to determine if a student is a dependent or an independent. And independent students do not require a parent or guardian to complete the FAFSA, but it may require additional documentation to verify that the student is actually considered an independent. And we know dependency is a big cause of confusion, so we have included 2 wonderful resources in both Spanish and English that will address most of your questions. So here's one of the screens with some dependency questions. And let's see, go to the next slide. Yeah, so if the student is considered a dependent, again, for FAFSA purposes, not for federal income tax purposes. If the student is a dependent, then we look at the parent's demographics, including marital status and month and year that they were either married, remarried, separated, divorced, or widowed. We also look at the type of tax return filed, if any, and the number of people in the parent's household. Here's what the parent's demographics section looks like. And then in addition to income tax information, the FAFSA will also ask to see if any of these benefits were received. This includes Medicaid or Supplemental Security Income, known as SSI, Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, known as SNAP, free or reduced price school lunch, temporary assistance for needy families, known as TANF, and special supplemental nutrition program for women, infants, and children, known as WIC. So the FAFSA asks for all kinds of financial information, but for tax information specifically, there's a handy tool for transferring that straight from the IRS. So you can utilize the IRS data retrieval tool, and this securely and accurately transfers over all that tax information. But you have to enter in the correct and exact address information that was on your tax return to be able to use this. And if a family is unable to use the DRT, then they should have their tax return available so that they can enter in that information manually. Students or parents who are married and filed their taxes as married filing separately, or who are married and filed as head of household, or who filed a Puerto Rican or a foreign tax return, these people are not eligible to use the IRS DRT, so they will need to enter their information manually. So as you see here, clicking that button will allow you to link your tax information from the IRS. FAFSA, like we've said, it uses prior year tax information, meaning the tax information we're referring to is from 2 years ago, which means families can complete the FAFSA sooner. And that means that for this 2021-2022 FAFSA cycle, families are going to be using their 2019 tax return that they just completed in 2020. And what is the tax information used for? It's used to determine the needs-based aid that the student is eligible to receive. So if you hear any hesitancy around sharing this information, continue to emphasize that it really is determining the kind of supports that students will receive to pay for college. So step 4 is to sign and submit the FAFSA. Both the Student and the parent must sign using their FSA ID if they're submitting it electronically, but the application can also be printed, signed, and mailed. We really encourage you to submit electronically as it's much faster, but there are a few instances when printing and mailing might be the only option. So what happens after signing and submitting the FAFSA? It takes 3 to 5 business days for the Department of Education to process the FAFSA. You can check its status immediately online or through the My Student Aid mobile app. And then the student will receive what's called a student aid report, and that gives you a summary of the FAFSA data that was submitted. So be sure to review this report carefully and make any corrections that are needed. The financial aid office at the school that the student wants to attend might also let the student know if any additional information is needed or corrections need to be made. So when reviewing the student aid report, first, you need to consistently check your email account or the mail if you didn't provide an email for the student aid report. And it can take 3 days to 3 weeks. So when you receive the report, you'll check for accuracy and make any corrections necessary at fafsa.gov. You'll check for the estimated family contribution listed, or the EFC. And if the EFC is missing, it means the FAFSA is incomplete. Now, there might also be a note that some information needs to be corrected or that the student has been selected for verification. This document, it's really important to read it carefully and take any required action immediately. So here's an example of a student aid report. You can see the student's EFC circled in green. All right, so step 6 is the verification process, which consists of making corrections and providing additional information. And this process is completely normal. So you might find out you've been selected for verification through the student aid report, or the college might notify you to contact them and follow up with some documentation. But again, this doesn't mean the student's in trouble. It's completely normal. Many students will be selected for verification, especially if they were unable to use the IRS data retrieval tool. Again, they're not in trouble. It's just a means of providing additional information or documentation to verify what they had put on their FAFSA. And the verification process varies by each school, so it is really important to seek guidance and support directly from the college that has selected the student for verification. That college is going to have specific forms that the student needs to complete in addition to the paperwork that they request from the student. And it's really important to respond quickly to these requests to clarify any information. Families in some cases might need to order a free tax transcript to provide as documentation. But ultimately, college financial aid offices, they're really there to help the students through this process. And since the process is so specific to each individual college, we recommend contacting the college's financial aid office for help. All right, so step 7 is receiving and accepting your financial aid awards. Each college that accepts the student will send a financial aid award letter. And for the school the student wants to attend, they must either accept or decline each type of aid. Generally, we recommend accepting aid in the following order. 1 being free money, of course, those scholarships and grants. 2 being earned money through a work-study job. And 3, borrowed money, such as low-interest federal student loans. All right, so that was oh, go ahead. Was someone asking a question? Okay, sorry. All right, so that was a lot of information introducing financial aid and the steps to complete the FAFSA. We want to spend a little bit of time talking about common mistakes as well as some issues that might come up because of COVID. So some common mistakes include not using the correct website. There are a lot of scam websites out there that try to get students to pay a fee to complete their FAFSA. The FAFSA is always completely 100% free. So always go to fafsa.gov. Sometimes students think they've completed the entire application, but it's not 100% complete. So continuously check the status of the FAFSA, make sure that all of its progress is complete. One mistake is not completing the FAFSA as soon as it's available. Again, some aid is first come, first serve. Other mistakes like inputting incorrect information or listing only one college and not adding additional schools that the student wanted their information sent to. Not using the IRS data retrieval tool when a student and their family is eligible to use that tool. Not reading definitions carefully. Again, emphasizing like not 100% completing the FAFSA by not signing it. Another mistake is not submitting within 45 days of starting it. So there is that window that you have to complete it. And then not filing by the deadline for the school that the student is applying to. And that goes back to those priority deadlines that we had mentioned. And then a huge misstep is to wait until after graduation to complete the FAFSA. We know all of you awesome educators are there to support your students now, and in the summer you might have other commitments outside of school and teaching. So we want your high school seniors to get started ASAP and get through it before they graduate. So many of the pages will have this little question mark icon next to the questions, and you can click that to find more details and definitions of certain terms. So this is just a way to avoid that mistake of answering a question incorrectly because you didn't read the definition carefully. All right, so now let's discuss some specific concerns that are related to financial situations caused by COVID. So here are some scenarios you might encounter. So what if the financial situation of the student and their family changed significantly because of financial hardships or unemployment related to COVID? So the student and their family, like I mentioned, will submit 2019 tax information, which might not reflect their current financial situation. And in this case, the student should communicate their current situation to the financial aid office at the school immediately after completing the FAFSA and before receiving an award offer. So another scenario, what if my student did this and their financial aid award still doesn't reflect their financial need? So in this case, we recommend that the student appeal directly to the college with documentation. So colleges can use what is known as professional judgment to adjust the information on the FAFSA, and these adjustments could impact the student's EFC and their grant eligibility. And there are some really awesome appeal templates available on Swift Student. It's an incredible tool that helps students navigate what's really a confusing process, and it allows students to advocate for themselves. So of course, when you get this slide deck, you'll be able to click that link and access those templates. And now we're going to talk about some best practices for promoting FAFSA completion, both in a remote learning environment or a virtual learning environment, and in person. And I want to preface this by saying our team has met virtually with college access professionals all across the country at NCAN's virtual conference this month. And I can tell you there's no magic solution to these difficult times we face, but we can certainly adapt some of our current practices to better fit the situations we're facing. So some things we recommend using prior year data to set goals and to monitor progress. And we have dashboards for that, and we'll talk about that right after this slide. We also recommend communicating through multiple channels. So using email, social media, school website, texting, or using platforms like Remind and Signalvine. We have templates for all of these types of communications. And with COVID in mind, we really recommend having a web page that serves as one central hub for your students to find different updates and resources. And then we recommend conveying the benefits of completing the FAFSA early and then keeping students updated on priority deadlines. So like I said earlier, we have a spreadsheet with both admissions and financial aid priority deadlines for Alabama colleges and universities. And many of the resources that I'm linking are contained in our educators toolkit, which can be found on alabamagoestocollege.org. That's Alabama spelled out, and then the number 2. And on that web page, if you click the educators button, you'll find this toolkit that has a link to a Google Drive with tons of things like one-pagers and graphics and templates. All right, so we recommended using prior year data to set goals and monitor progress, and you can do that by accessing our Cash for College data dashboard at alabamapossible.org/dashboard. So our Cash for College data dashboard will be updated with the first data release for the 2021-22 cycle, and this update comes after the first week of October. We'll, of course, alert you in our newsletter. On the dashboard, you're able to access school-wide data, and it's updated weekly from October through June, a great way to see how your campaign is progressing. And there are all these different tabs at the top that you can click through. The school detail tab shows your school's current percentage compared to last year's FAFSA completion percentage. So it really lets you compare year to year easily. You can also see a pie chart that shows you how many applications have been submitted, completed, or are missing for your seniors. And then it lets you compare your school to other schools, whether that's across the county or across the district. So there's lots of different ways to look at school-wide data here. But we also have another dashboard, and that is from the Alabama Commission on Higher Education. It's their FAFSA completion project. And this is a student lookup portal which allows you to view the progress of your individual students. So once you have a login to the system, you can see so many details. So the screenshot on the right shows you whether a FAFSA is completed for a student, when it was submitted, whether the student has been selected for verification. And if the student's application isn't completed, you can see what steps they have left. So if you're participating in the Alabama Goes to College campaign, utilizing this portal is required, and we can't emphasize enough how important this tool is, especially during COVID. If you're not in a face-to-face learning environment with your students and you can't check up on them in person, you can use this tool to track your students' progress and then maybe send out batch emails. So one email to all students who have started but are missing their signature, one email to students who haven't even started, and then maybe a congratulatory email to all the students who have completed. And if you've reached out to us regarding access to this portal, we are currently coordinating with the AIC team on getting everyone access. So we will follow up with you and get in touch with you as soon as possible if you're still waiting for login credentials for this. All right, so last few best practices. We recommend collaborating with other teachers to discuss financial aid during relevant classes like economics or government. And we know that the burden on counselors and educators are extraordinary right now. So as much as we can incorporate financial aid conversations directly into our curriculum, the better. And we have a lesson plan for that. So that's in our educators toolkit. We recommend partnering with local organizations and community colleges to host virtual events promoting the FAFSA. Especially if you're all virtual right now, we recommend recording these for later viewing. And those local partners can also be a great resource for providing prizes and incentives that will motivate the students. All right, so let's look at some resources. You'll have all these links when we send out the slides later. The first comes from the Office of Federal Student Aid. It's part of the U.S. Department of Education. The Financial Aid Toolkit has numerous resources for all different audiences, and these are things like informational one-pagers, PowerPoints, and then even videos, and that's at financialaidtoolkit.ed.gov. Of course, our Educators Toolkit that I've been mentioning, it includes our Cash for College Toolkit, and we've been putting together planning documents, graphics for social media, and email templates. Again, all of that can be found at alabamagoestocollege.org. The National College Attainment Network's FAFSA Resource Library is another great tool. It has a planning calendar, training and capacity building resources, and communication tools. It's also a really great place to learn more best practices from schools all across the country, and you can find that at ncan.org. And then we really recommend partnering with those financial aid offices at your nearby 2-year and 4-year colleges. They're an incredible resource, especially when it comes to assisting students through the verification process. And lastly, of course, you can call us at 334-316-6155 or email us at alabamagoestocollege@alabamaimpossible.org. Sorry, that's algoestocollege@alabamaimpossible.org. Real quick, some student resources. Students can read through financial aid overviews and summaries at FAFSA.gov. They can also call Federal Student Aid. That hotline is a really awesome resource. It's helped so many students that we've been working with over the summer. They can call that at 1-800-433-3243. And just like we recommend you partnering with your local financial aid offices, we recommend that students get in the practice of contacting their school's financial aid office where they'll be attending. And of course, they are more than welcome to come to us as a resource by calling or emailing us. All right, so I want to talk about some upcoming events. The Federal Student Aid Office just announced that they'll be hosting a financial aid boot camp on October 20th and 21st. We'll make sure to plug registration for that boot camp in our weekly newsletter once registration is available. It's not yet up yet. And then finally, like I mentioned at the beginning, we'll be hosting a future webinar discussing more advanced FAFSA completion topics. And we'll also announce the date of that webinar in our weekly newsletter. So thank you so much for holding on this long. I'm now going to turn it over to Brittany to facilitate Q&A. And whatever we don't get to, we will be following up by email if you included your email address with the question in the chat box.
Thank you, May. Okay, so it looks like we have a couple of questions. First of all, do you have an informational video on YouTube that can be shared with the students?
Definitely. We have a few things that Alabama Possible has done in the past, and then we also have some great videos that come from Federal Student Aid as well.
Okay, and what about parents' FAFSA ID? Do you still need to wait 3 days for them?
Yeah, creating the FSA ID, for some people it's immediate, but for some people it takes almost 3 days. So we just give that as the general window, but it'll be the same for students and parents or guardians.
Okay, are the dependency info and flowcharts in English, Spanish located in the toolkit or somewhere else?
Ooh, great question. Those are not in our toolkit yet, but I will drop those into our toolkit right after this webinar. And then of course, they'll be linked in the PowerPoint slides you receive.
Okay, can educators see what the students, what students have completed the FAFSA?
So if you have access to AIC's Student Lookup portal, then you will be able to see progress for individual students. And they highlight some of the key steps along the way. So for instance, one thing that they highlight is whether a student or the parent or guardian is missing the signature page. But yes, you'll be able to see the progress so that you can really intentionally reach out to students and keep them updated on where they are and what they have left to do.
Okay, and seniors this year will need 2019 tax documents, correct?
Yes, so most everyone is going to apply for the 2021-22 FAFSA cycle, which uses 2019 tax documents.
We listened to a webinar with Sally Mae about their new tool, Embark. What are your thoughts? I'm concerned about sending families to any website other than FAFSA.gov.
I have not checked out Embark, but I'm happy to look it over and let you know my thoughts after reviewing it.
Okay, and where will this video be uploaded for future reference?
This video and a bunch of our other professional learning webinars can be found at youtube.com/AlabamaPossible. And for any question that I only addressed verbally but needs a little more context or more links, we'll definitely put that in the follow-up email.
Well, okay, will students use the 2019 tax returns to fill out the 2020-2021 FAFSA?
So if a student is doing the 2020-21 FAFSA, they'll be using 2018 tax returns, but not many high school seniors will be completing the 2020-21 FAFSA. All of them will be completing the 2021-22 FAFSA.
I see asking for a question to be repeated. What question?
It might have been which FAFSA to complete, but most high school seniors are going to do the 2021-22 FAFSA using 2019 tax return information. The only time that a high school senior might be doing the 2020-21 FAFSA is if they are planning to enroll in college the summer immediately following their high school graduation.
Is there a specific video that you suggest from your YouTube channel? There are a lot to go through.
It really depends what you're looking for, and that reminds me that if you have suggestions for future webinars this year, we welcome those. We'd love to collaborate and consider your recommendations. So if you have something specific, some content that you're looking for specifically, feel free to email us and I'll either direct you to something that already exists or we'll put something together and host a future webinar.
Okay, so our seniors use what year FAFSA and what year tax returns?
It's really confusing, so no worries for asking me to repeat this. So seniors this year, this is the way I like to think of it. So this year we're in the 2020-21 school year, right? But we're applying for financial aid for the 2021-22 school year, so their first year of college. So because they're applying for financial aid during 2021-22, they're going to complete the FAFSA that's 2021-22. And because they're using prior year tax returns, they're going to be using 2019 tax information. And y'all know that tax season was different this year because of COVID, so the deadline wasn't the traditional April 15th. There was the extension through July. So that might also contribute to some confusion about which documents you're using.
Okay. And is there a specific video that would be a good introduction for FAFSA for seniors?
Most of our videos really are going to be geared towards educators. So I'm happy to put together a list of things for students and families if that's something you'd prefer. But I also have not looked at our whole catalog of videos in a while, so I can revisit that and then recommend some.
All right, well, I think that's everything. Alrighty, thank you everybody again for joining us on our webinar today.